Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, everybody, to the Sitka Church of Christ. This morning, we're going to be looking at Numbers. Numbers. We've been doing a series on the Torah, loosely correlated with the series from the Bible Project. They don't have study guides for Numbers, and they don't have study guides for Deuteronomy, so we're kind of on our own on these, but still, I took a lot of inspiration from their poster especially, and their video for Numbers and Deuteronomy, and so you'll see some of their artwork here. A good understanding of the book of Numbers here is really going to be helpful to us, and I would say it's even critical for us to understand the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures through the eyes of what's going on here in the book of Numbers, and more broadly in the narrative of the story of the Torah. Because this is the mindset that the New Testament writers had, right? And so Numbers comes at this crucial junction in the narrative of the story of the Torah, of the law of Moses, the teachings, the 5 books of Moses. And so the history of how God is longing to dwell physically with his people in a special land that he has set aside for them is what the book of Numbers is all about. But it doesn't work out so smoothly, right? There's a bumpy road here. That's why the title of the lesson, if you saw it on YouTube or not, but it says Numbers, a road trip that goes south. It goes south pretty quickly, like 3 days after they leave Sinai. It's already bad deals. So but God is not willing to give up on them, and that's the major thing we need to think about through this book. Yes, things go badly, but God is not willing to give up on them. And so the book of Numbers, like the other 3 books of the Torah that we've studied so far, gets its name from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, translated, 200 BC, thereabouts, and it means numbers. Well, it's arithmoi is the Greek word. It sounds like arithmetic. It means numbers. The problem is, there's only 2 or 3 chapters here that are devoted to the census, censuses, something like that, whatever plural of census is. And so the Hebrew word name for the book is a lot more appropriate, I think. It's from the 5th word in the Hebrew, and it means in the wilderness. It's bar midbar, or bamidbar, and it's in the desert of, or in the wilderness of. And so I think it's important to realize that is really where this whole storyline is taking place until they get to the plains of Moab, which is still not exactly a green forest. But the book of Numbers is sort of this epic narrative, or this epic travel log. Like we have travel stories that we see today on TV, and they all only focus on the very positive aspects of the Venice canals or something. This is a travel log, but it tells every crucial detail, and it's a manual to Israel about how to conduct themselves while traveling. The problem is, by the time this book is written, they've already traveled, right? So why would we write down a travel log about traveling if we're not traveling anymore? Well, the idea here is that this pilgrimage, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 2, says that this journey should only have taken about 11 days. But instead, it takes them 40 years. And so this is a very, very long camping trip with a lot of interesting stories. So how did we get here? Well, this is the Exodus. This is the story of the Exodus of Israel, right? Israel has broken the bonds of slavery. God has broken the bonds of slavery for Israel. They have now left Egypt. The most powerful ruler of the world at this point, most likely, is Pharaoh. Pharaoh has been defeated by God miraculously. They've come to this Mount Horeb, it's also called Sinai, and they make this covenant with God, and God makes a covenant with them, and everything seems like it's going so well, except that not even 40 days into Moses making this covenant with God and communing with God, they break the first and the second rule of the covenant that they make with God. So the covenant is broken. And so from the time they're at Sinai until the time they leave Sinai is about a year. And that covers half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and a third here of Numbers. So the covenant is broken, and Leviticus is all about the priests and the laws of purity and ritual and how to be made holy and how to get back into that right state of holiness so that you can be in the presence of God. So the covenant is broken. They're given the tabernacle and priests to make that relationship right in the end of Exodus and in all of Leviticus. And now in Numbers, now finally here after a book and a half, 2 books worth of laws and regulations and ritual, now we finally come to where we can leave Sinai, and that's what the book of Numbers really picks up on here. So there's 3 main sections here in Numbers. I mean, you can really divide it any number of ways. On the handout that I handed out, I did a topical outline, and that is, there's 2 travel narratives. There's 2 times when they're traveling. You can see that on the slide behind me. There's 4 other narratives. That's, when they're preparing. That's when Moses and Aaron are talking about leadership. And then you have the Balaam cycle and the seduction of the people, and then the end of the book. And so 2 travel narratives, 4 other narratives, and then 2 census lists. That's one way of breaking it up. Here on the slide behind me, it's a little bit more intuitive because it's by chapter. The first 10 chapters include some more laws, and it includes some more promises to the sons of Levi, the sons of Aaron especially, that are going to be the priests. And that's the first 10 chapters. And then chapter 10 picks up and we start to leave. And so the first part is how the nation was ordering themselves. They were preparing themselves for this journey. And the priests and the Levites were to act while they were on the move, and that's the second part, in the wilderness of Paran. And then in the third part is how they were supposed to prepare themselves for the conquest of Canaan, and that's on the plains of Moab. When they get ready, some people decide that they don't want to go into the land, that the land right there is good. Moses says that's okay, as long as you fight the same with your brothers. And so final preparations in the plains of Moab here is where the book ends in the last 10 chapters of the book. And so throughout all of these sections, the storyline flows a lot more clearly to us, like a riveting and dramatic movie. It may not be organized the way we would want to organize it, okay, all nice and neat and everything into a straight up drama, but there is a storyline that flows like a dramatic movie. It goes from drama to drama to drama. And everything starts out great, but then it all goes horribly wrong, and it ends with this final redemptive moment, and it's supposed to point towards the many surprising acts of God's grace. And that's what the book of Numbers the big picture is all about. So the first 10 chapters here, they're at Sinai, and so now we can see in the first few chapters here why the Hebrew name for the book seems more appropriate for the content of the book. Yes, the first couple chapters have a census in them. There's lots of numbers, but that's only 3 of the 36 chapters in this book. Israel's still at Sinai, and if we remember, this is a very important place for them, right? They came here because God led them here, and He led them out of bondage in Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here. They received the 10 words here, the 10 commandments here. They built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 whole year now, because we find out in chapter 9 they're going to start celebrating the second Passover. And now The organization of the people begins on God's command so that they can prepare to leave. And so this is not just a count of individuals, though. This census here has a very distinct military or militaristic overtone. Let me read chapter 1 and verse 3. Or verse 2. Take a census of all the congregation, or take a sum of all the congregation of the sons of Israel by their families, their fathers' households, according to the number of names, every male, head by head, from 20 years old, and that's where we stop, right? No, the verse keeps going, and upward, who is able to go out to war in Israel. And you and Aaron shall number them, or muster them. That's a military term. You shall muster them by their armies. So this is a distinct military overtone. Why? We don't often think of the Exodus this way, and it often has negative connotations today when we say holy war, but that's what they were preparing for. They were preparing to go into the land, the promised land, that already had people in it, and displace those people. They were going to go into that land and remove those people. This is preparations for a holy war. Remember, God said that the lands, the sins of the Amorites and the sins of the Amalekites, they were full. They were complete. There was enough of them that God was going to bring judgment onto them. And a large reason for that was human sacrifice, especially of children. So God was placed at the center of the camp. They're doing this ordering. They're getting everybody all lined up. God is put at the very center of the camp, right? The tabernacle, and God's presence physically dwelling in that portable temple, right? We call the tabernacle. It's also called the tent of meeting. It's also called the tabernacle of testimony. We're told that his presence dwelled like a cloud during the day and like a pillar of fire at night. It's not that they swapped out. It's that the cloud was glowing just like it was on the mountain, because the cloud came off the mountain and hovered over the tent. And around that tent were the Levites camped out, and around them were the rest of the congregation of Israel. And it was a good setup, right? You have this immensely powerful being that is living in the very center of camp, and he's already freed them from slavery, this immensely powerful God. And now he's going to lead them to the promised land. And this pattern is a visual symbol for the Israelites, right? Just like the food laws, that God is at the center of their very existence as a people. Can you imagine the anticipation in chapter 9 and chapter 10 when that fiery cloud lifts and they're finally taking off here? They finally have ordered themselves the way God wants them. They have realized their identity, and maybe not nationally yet, but close. They've realized their identity as God's people, and they break camp, and the ark leads the way, followed by the armies of Judah and so on. And so this is a symbol of how God's presence is leading, is leading and guiding them through the wilderness. And there's excitement and there's enthusiasm in the air. But things go south pretty quick right? That's the title of the lesson, how this road trip goes south. And so they didn't even make it 3 days, right? The people begin to complain about their hunger and their thirst. And even Moses' brother Aaron, who is the new chief priest, right? Because the priests have been chosen in the first 10 chapters. And Aaron as the chief priest, and Moses' sister Miriam, they start to question if he's the only one that God is leading the people through. And they do all this in front of the congregation. And so God punishes this murmuring again. And there's several different ways he punishes their murmuring throughout the next few chapters, but one is with a plague of food. He gives them too much food, right? He gives them all these quail, and then he punishes Miriam with leprosy. And after these events, we arrive in the next major section of Numbers, right? So we've got chapters 1 through 10 talking about Sinai and before they leave with the Levites. Then we got this travel section here where things go south pretty quickly. And after this, we're in the next major section of the book, which is the wilderness of Paran. And so if you'll notice the blue arrows on the chart behind me, we see Israel complaining. We see Aaron and Miriam complaining, and God punishes them. Well, we're going to see this pattern again when we move from Paran to the plains of Moab later in the book. But for right now, notice that when they get to the land of Paran, they send out the 12 spies to scout out the promised land, right? And all the 12 spies return, and they're in awe of the bounty of this land, saying that it flows with milk and honey. And two of them, Joshua and Caleb, are optimistic that they can overcome the inhabitants of the land, right? That's chapter 13. And so 10 of the spies, though, are really, really just freaked out. And they're freaked out about the inhabitants of the land. They think that they're giants, and they lead, and that those 10 people that are really freaked out lead to a loss of trust in God, a loss of faith in his promises. And they desire, or they want to appoint a new leader that's going to take them back to Egypt. And they even tried to kill Moses and Aaron. They refuse God's promise of a blessing, and God honors that choice. See, God has great respect for man's choices. And so he tells them in chapter 14, in verse 22, surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, have not listened to my voice. They shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. Just as they had spoken about God in his hearing, so God would surely do to them the same thing. Verse 28 of chapter 14 says, say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Be careful what you ask for. That's what God says. So you have spoken, so I will do it. So this current generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their children, who said that they would become prey in the wilderness, will get to know the promised land. They were worried about becoming food themselves, prey. God reverses that and shows them that only those people they thought were going to be the weakest are going to be the strongest now. And so these stories here of rebellion are often referred to by a lot of other biblical authors, and I have a few here on the slide behind me. We have Isaiah 63 and Ezekiel 20 and Jeremiah 7 when we're talking about the prophets, and we got several Psalms. When we talk about poets, we have 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews 3. My favorite from the New Testament is John chapter 3 and verses 14 and 15, right before the famous John 3:16. Jesus identifies himself as the snake that is lifted up, like that snake that was lifted up in the wilderness. So the Son of Man. Anyway, we'll get to that one. So the current generation is going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness, and these stories serve as a reminder to us that while God will always remain faithful to his people and his promises, he will also honor the people's choices. God does not send people to hell, right? He's simply honoring their choice. And so hell is this ultimate expression. Hell, and I really like this statement. Maybe it's because I didn't write it. But hell is the ultimate expression of God's high regard for the dignity of man. He has never forced us to choose him, even when that means that we would choose hell. And another prominent example of this here in this section that we're reading is Korah's rebellion, where God respects Korah's bad decisions, but affirms those of Korah's family that were faithful and loyal to him, right? So we always think about the Korah's rebellion, oh, the earth swallowed them up, they're all gone, right? Well, we find out much later that God has spared some of his family, some of the future generations. And even 11 of our 150 some odd Psalms come from their descendants. And so we've moved from the wilderness of Paran now, where Israel has rebelled, and God bans them from the land and gives them some new laws. Korah rebels. God affirms Moses and Aaron's leadership and gives them some more new laws. And the result is the same pattern. If you remember those blue arrows from before, Israel complains, Aaron complains, Miriam complains, and Moses complains. So as we move from the wilderness of Paran to the plains of Moab, Aaron and Miriam die, and we find out that Moses fails in his abilities to lead also, and finds out that he will die and not enter the land also. And so we see all this death and destruction, and we often think of as God as punishing these people and being a harsh schoolmaster, just waiting for them to mess up so he can rap them on the head with the ruler. And that's not at all what's happening, though. And I'm gonna try and make that picture a lot more clear now, because God is healing the nation after these punishments. And he's healing them and fighting for them even though they don't even know about it. So this trip really only gets worse as we leave Paran in the next major section here into Moab. And even Moses has that moment of rebellion. And let me just read Numbers chapter 20 real quick. Chapter 20 and verse 12. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me to treat me as holy in the sight of sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given to them. That word he uses there in chapter 20, in verse 12, is a Hebrew word. We've already said it several times today. It's the word amen. It's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6 of Abraham. So when the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not amened me, because you have not believed in me, because you have not trusted in my faithfulness to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given to them. It's this, even after these great events that have happened, there's even more rebellion among the people. And this time it's going to result in a snake attack. And this is one of my favorite stories in Numbers. And I wanted to spend some time here on this story specifically because of what it means and how it was represented by Jesus. What makes these rebellions even worse is that every single day that they've been in the desert, God has been providing for them. He's provided meat, he's provided manna, he's provided water to drink, and all the while he's offered his forgiveness and redemption. But in spite of all these loving actions, Israel says that they wish they could go back. or they wish that they had died in slavery. And what makes the snake story so astounding to me is that God does not give up on these people. I mean, how many of us would have given up already on these people? God tells Moses to make a bronze snake on a pole. Now, what's the purpose of this bronze snake, right? The purpose is that it is the image of what is killing them. Then this idol snake statue thing, they're supposed to look to it and be healed. And it can't be a representation of God, right? They did that once on Sinai, and that didn't work out so well for them. So the symbol of the snake on a pole is a paradox. It's a symbol of his judgment. What God gives as a way of escape for these Israelites, or as a way to take refuge from his judgment, is also a symbol of the judgment itself. And so this is a paradox. Paradoxically, they look to the symbol of God's judgment, and it's also the medium of him granting life to them. The story is, it's very, very strange for most biblical stories. It's very different. But at the center of it is the symbol that at the same time is a sign of God's judgment, is also a sign of God's grace and life that he wants to give to the people. And so this is the mind-blowing connection here. In John chapter 3, let me just read John chapter 3 and verse 14. One more page. And 15. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Believes in him. Anyone who amens him, who trusts in the faithfulness of God to his promises. We call that faith. Jesus starts talking about how he's going to die so that others can live and have life. And in this conversation with Nicodemus here, he brings up this story. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too the Son of Man shall be lifted up, so that others may have life. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is being lifted up. His being lifted up is pointing forward to his being lifted up on the cross. And the way that he rescues them is itself a symbol of his judgment on them, of their evil behavior. It's exactly how Jesus understood this story of what was happening on the cross. It's an amazing symbolic story. So this brings us to the last big section of the story of Numbers, the narrative, the overarching theme of what's going on. And that is, the last major section is the plains of Moab. And this is just to the east of the River Jordan. It's probably one of the most, I've already said this like 3 times, one of the most astounding stories in the book is the story of Balaam and Balak. It makes up, I think, 3 or 4 chapters here, and that equates to 10% of the book of Numbers. So it's an important story for us as we look at Numbers. And this is the story of Balaam, who was a prophet for hire, right? Israel's just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab, Balak, he's really worried about what's going on. He doesn't want to let these people come through his land. He's afraid they're going to strip the land of all its good, use up all the resources. And so he does the only sensible thing to do, right? Let's go out, find the most powerful sorcerer around, and hire him to curse your enemy. I mean, that's pretty sensible in terms of the ancient Near East. Balaam is a well-known figure. A lot of times we don't cover this, but Balaam is a well-known figure from this area because archaeologists have found inscriptions talking about Balaam and his incredible power. And so Balaam is this prophet for hire, and so he goes along with it. I mean, that's what he does, right? God, however, only allows Balaam to bless Israel 7 times, right? In fact, even after attempting to curse them 7 times. And the most surprising blessing of this story, though, is where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. This is chapter 24. Let me just read a few things. This is his prophecy from Peor when he says, water shall flow from his buckets. This is euphemism, if you might imagine. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be many waters. Abraham had promised that his seed would become a great nation. At this point, they're in the process of becoming that great nation. Then over in verse 9 of the same chapter 24 of Numbers, he says, he couches, he lies down as a lion who dares rouse him. As a lion, who dares rouse him? Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you, talking about Israel. So here we already have 2 references to Abraham. Now we have a reference to Abraham's son, Judah, right? Who's like a lion's whelp, like a lion's roar. Who is the lion of the tribe of Judah? That is Christ. This is a pagan prophet, mind you, making all these prophecies. And then he says in verse 17, a star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall rise from Israel. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Remember the promise to Jacob's sons? So there's a lot going on here in chapter 24 that God is speaking through this pagan priest. And the king is very, very upset about this. 7 times he's given these sacrifices and he's asked Balaam to curse him, and Balaam has said he can only say what God tells him to. And this king that Balaam is prophesying now is connected to the promise of Abraham that all the nations would be blessed through his family. Even if we skip over the talking donkey part, this story has an even more astounding aspect. And what is that? Israel has no idea that any of this stuff is going on. They're down in the valley rebelling against God, and God is up here blessing them 7 times. And he has stopped the cursing from Balaam 7 times. Instead, he's given them blessings. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? Let's bring it all back and make heads or tails of what Numbers then means for us. Here we are. This is a picture of Sitka for those watching that may not know. Here we are in Sitka. We are down in the valley. We are down in the camp. We are sitting just outside of our own promised land. We're just going about our lives, living our lives, thinking, right, we're not nearly as bad as those Israelites, right? They turn their back on God regularly. Not me, right? And right about then, it should be hitting you upside the head about that the storyline of Numbers has completed its work. The moment that you think you aren't like Israel, this story has done its job, because we are living our lives here in Sitka camp. We're just outside the promised land. We are often rebelling against God, right? We're totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting, not only protecting, but even blessing us. And so this morning then, if you can identify with these people, if you have been living a life of rebellion against God, you need to be purified of that sin before you can stand before God. You can't stand before God with the way you are right now. And the only way to do that is to make a decision today. Don't wait. Make that decision today to put to death what is earthly inside of you, whether it's sexual immorality or impurity or lust or evil desire or greed. Of course, I'm quoting Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. And how do we put to death that old way of life? How do we do that? Well, if we back up a chapter in Colossians, it tells us, Colossians chapter 2 and verse 12 says that having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith. That faith, that's that same word, that amen. Faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. Abraham believed God. Abraham faithed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. If you put your faith in God through baptism, you too can put to death that old man of sin and be raised up through the raising of Jesus Christ to a new life. God is willing to raise you up to a new life, a life in harmony with him, so that we can live in the very presence of God. So the question is, will you come now and make that happen? If you need to, you can contact us at sitkachurch@gmail.com or any of the other number of ways on the internet, or you can just give us a call. Thanks for joining us this morning.